You and me, we're members of a storytelling species. At the heart of every person, every nation, every religion lives a great story that we tell about ourselves. The Torah is the Jewish people's story. Handwritten in ancient Hebrew on a parchment scroll, it's 5 books, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, introduce us to our founding figures and recount our earliest experiences, and contain the 613 mitzvot, the commandments, that guide all aspects of what it means to live a Jewish life. You can spend a lifetime studying Torah, and it would be a life very well spent. But what I want to give you now is the view from 35,000 feet. We're going to zoom way out and see the whole picture and how it fits together. For that, we're going to talk about the Torah not just as 5 books, but as a drama, one of the greatest dramas, in 6 distinct acts. Act 1. Act 1 of the Torah includes the opening 11 chapters of the book of Genesis. There are no Jews and almost no laws in the Torah's first act. Instead, we're focused on big stories of origin, how the whole world came to be. Starting with creation and continuing through the narratives of Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel, Noah and the flood, and the Tower of Babel. These stories seek to explain how and why we are who we are. Their themes are universal in scope. Gender and sexuality, the relationship between human beings and the natural world, the origins of our diversity, our innate propensity toward violence, and our capacity for redemption. We can't know how literally our biblical ancestors took these stories, but for millennia, the Jewish tradition has seen these texts not as scientific or historical accounts, but rather as a source of deepest inspiration. The great scholar, Rabbi Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, writes in the introduction to his commentary, Ha'emek HaDavar, that all of the Torah ought to be read as poetry, not prose. Poetry, not prose. I really like that. Read through that poetic lens, these stories don't have much to tell us about the natural history of the earth, but they do teach us a lot about how we ought to live on it. They teach us to see our world as a garden, and to see our jobs as tending to it and nurturing it. They teach us to see ourselves as made B'Tselem Elohim, in the image and likeness of God, and therefore invested with an innate dignity that no one can ever take away from us. The Torah's focus shifts abruptly as we enter the 12th chapter of Genesis and begin Act 2. We go from the macro story of everything to zoom in on the intimate and highly personal stories of our people's founding family, our patriarchs and matriarchs. It all starts with an aging couple, Abraham and Sarah, who hear God's voice telling them to set out from the only home they've ever known in Mesopotamia, to leave on a journey to a new land, the land of Israel. There they start a family to pass down the covenantal relationship that they formed with God to the next generation. This covenant, Brit in Hebrew, flows from them to their son Isaac and his wife Rebekah, to Jacob and his many wives and children, all the way down to us today. Every Jew who has ever lived has been the heir to this covenant of mutual loyalty and responsibility that began more than 3,000 years ago. Being in covenant with God is what it means, bottom line, to be a Jew. The patriarchs and matriarchs don't live easy lives. In fact, their family is subject to every kind of messed up daytime television dysfunction imaginable. Siblings plot against siblings, spouses plot against each other, relationships are torn apart through deceit, and jealousy and even acts of outright violence. It's interesting that the Torah doesn't paint our founding family as saints, but rather it allows us to know them as the incredibly flawed human beings that they were. Maybe the Torah wants to tell us that being a person has never been simple, and that by learning from our ancestors' honest experiences, we may be able to face the challenges of our own lives with just a bit more wisdom. Within 4 generations, this family that migrated into the land of Israel is forced to leave it. Jacob and 11 of his 12 sons make their way to Egypt searching for food during a famine, only to find the 12th son, Joseph, who had once been sold into slavery by his brothers, sitting there on the Egyptian throne. Joseph receives and reconciles with his family and tells them the story of how he rose from captivity to become the number 2 to Pharaoh himself. By the end of the book of Genesis, Joseph has resettled his family on the banks of the Nile River, and it seems that all will be well. Unfortunately, not so much. Act 3 begins with the words, "A new king arose over Egypt, who did not remember Joseph." This new Pharaoh takes a decidedly less friendly approach to immigrants than his predecessor did and orders the Israelites forced into slavery. From this dark point in our people's story, we begin a hero saga that will result ultimately in our nation's liberation. It starts, as hero stories often do, with the birth of a very special baby, Moses, who's saved from Egyptian cruelty. His mother and his sister hatch a plan to place him in a basket on the river, where the daughter of Pharaoh herself finds him. Raised as an Egyptian prince, he only later learns of his origins and finds he can no longer tolerate the cruelty that his people are subjected to. He flees Egypt, only to encounter God at a burning bush, telling him to return with the demand that rings through history, "Let my people go." Unsurprisingly, Pharaoh resists, and only after 10 really gruesome plagues does he ultimately relent. The climactic scene of Act 3 of the Torah is the Exodus itself, as hundreds of thousands of former Israelite slaves, along with a mixed multitude of others also seeking their freedom, rise up and leave their place of subjugation behind. 3 days into the desert, they find themselves trapped, with a sea in front of them and the army of Pharaoh coming up behind. In this moment, the Torah records that the sea splits wide open, and the Israelites march b'toch hayam b'yabasha, through the midst of the waves on dry land. Remember Rabbi Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, who said that we should read the Torah as poetry, not prose? This is powerful poetry. The waters close behind the liberated Israelites, washing away the past, making way for a new future. This is a scene of rebirth, since don't we all enter into this world through a narrow channel of waters? It's a new beginning. Act 4 begins on the other side of the sea, with a great wilderness yet to traverse. Our first stop in this desert journey is at the base of a mountain, Mount Sinai, where God appears to the entire gathered people to mutually recommit to the covenant of their ancestors. Moses goes up the mountain and brings down with him mitzvot, laws, the concrete expression of what it means to be in covenantal relationship with God. We spend our first year as a free people camped there in God's classroom. We pick up from Sinai at the start of Act 5, which covers the rest of our meandering journey toward the land of Israel. In total, our ancestors spent 40 long years in the desert, experiencing struggles and hardships as the old slave generation dies away and a new generation, born in freedom, rises to take their place. The Torah's final book, Deuteronomy, Act 6, is one long speech by Moses to his people at the end of their wandering before they cross over the Jordan River into Israel. Moses takes the opportunity to remind them of all that's happened to them, to give them blessings and also warnings of what could take place if they stray from the covenant during their new life in the Promised Land. And then in the Torah's final lines, Moses dies. An old chapter is ended. A new one can now get started. This is the beginning of our people's story, and there is so much more to say. Because it's out of this rich soil that all of Jewish civilization has grown. This is where our journey truly begins.
Ay, ay, ay,